witness chair. You're the first on our agenda, and we'll just formally introduce all of ourselves and then have you all introduce yourself too. Yeah.
I've done this in a few years.
Oh, it's like riding a bicycle.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us today. And we are the Senate Government Operations Committee in Vermont, and it is Friday, the 10th of February. And we're going to get started. With us today is the former Speaker of the Colorado House, Terrence Carroll, and he's going to share with us his experiences with ranked choice voting in Colorado. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy, the chair of the committee, and represent the Addison district, which is one of the Senate districts in Vermont. And
Olivia Parker, committee assistant.
Senator Tanya Vyhovsky, I'm the vice chair of the committee, and I represent Chittenden Central District.
Rebecca White, and I represent Windsor County District.
And Watson, Washington District, which is where we are right now.
Okay.
That's
that's
a great way of describing it.
yeah, right.
Allison Clarkson, Windsor County District.
Okay.
Yeah, and this
East
is
side, central, near Dartmouth, east side of Vermont. Connecticut River.
yeah, and I'm Middlebury. You're Burlington.
Essex, Burlington, Winooski, and Colchester.
I don't
But
think I drove through Burlington.
Burlington's further north, but it is the largest city in Vermont.
You probably flew into South Burlington, which is
No, I was in Boston the past year. It was a conference at the Kennedy School.
Oh, great.
And I drove up from Boston this morning.
got it.
Are you doing the Kennedy School program, or did you do it before?
I did it years ago, but I did a different, I didn't do the executive program in state and local government. I did a joint program between the Divinity School and the Kennedy School on the study of ethics and public life.
Oh, cool. Ooh, we'll have to have you back to talk to us about that.
As a member of
Wow.
the Senate Ethics.
What year?
Exactly.
What year?
2006. I'm also a Dane Baptist minister as well as being a lawyer.
So you were there when
Wow.
my dear friend Peter Combs was there.
Yes. At the Robert Chapel.
All
See,
right.
it's less than 6 degrees.
Small world. And this seat that is empty is Senator Bob Norris. He represents Franklin County, which is the northwest county of the state.
Okay.
He'll join us soon. Thank you so much for being with us today. If you could just introduce yourself for the record and then tell us about your experiences with ranked choice voting in Colorado.
Absolutely. I'm Terrence Carroll. I'm officially a senior voting and democracy fellow with Fair Vote, which is a democracy organization based in Washington, D.C. But I still live in Denver County, or Denver, Colorado. And I'm also the former Speaker of the House of the great state of Colorado. I'm the first African-American Speaker of the House, and to date, unfortunately, the only African-American to have been Speaker of the House. And I've been out of office now for 12 years, and I'm a practicing attorney, and most of my work is in election law and political law. And that's really what I do for Fair Vote, as well as providing high-level legislative strategy, both at the state and federal level, and working on Voting Rights Act legislation at state levels and ranked choice voting around the country as part of my role at Fair Vote.
Wow. That's very cool. And you're an ordained minister.
Yes, and I have a Master of Divinity degree and a Jewish doctorate. In the Bible, I think we're called Pharisees.
Yeah.
Yes.
The interesting thing is my brother is the same. My brother is a lawyer and a minister as well. So
He's my fellow Pharisee.
yes, I'll have to tell him about you.
That's a quick question. In your capacity as an election lawyer, have you often worked with the Campaign Legal Center?
I do. I'm part of what we call the Legal Roundtable. That's one of my roles at Fair Vote. And the Legal Roundtable are groups like the Brennan Center, Campaign Legal Center, NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, all the groups that work on election law policy, voting policy, and litigation. Fair Vote does not do election-related litigation, although when I was in private practice, I was a partner in one of the largest law firms in the world, and I did do some election-related litigation. But Fair Vote's role is policy drafting, identifying red flags, trying to bridge the world between the law, public policy, and real politics. That's our role. That's my role as part of the. Sometimes lawyers forget that there's a real world of politics in the work that we do.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, what we have a bill that would implement ranked choice voting for the presidential primary next year in 2024. So it's kind of a tight timeline. And so one of the things that we're most interested in is the logistics of implementing ranked choice voting over a number like 9 months period, and how we might consider doing that.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. And I guess I'll start by saying, how I got to this place in terms of working on election reforms, democracy reform, ranked choice voting in particular. I'm a native of Washington, D.C. So I grew up not too far down the road, several hours down the road. More importantly, my mother never finished 3rd grade. She's the daughter of a sharecropper in Southern Maryland, in the segregated South. And my grandfather was a sharecropper who bought the land that my family had been enslaved on. And my great-grandfather is a formerly enslaved person. My mother had me when she was 51. She was born in 1917. So that's how we kind of got to where we, how I get back there very quickly. Long story short, though, my grandfather passed before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was adopted, and my mother never cast her first vote until she moved to Washington, D.C. And so for me, this is a very personal issue that there are people in my family who could not vote very early on. My grandfather and my great-grandfather never had a chance to exercise the franchise. So for me, my life work is always, that's why I went to law school. My life work has always been committed to voting rights and how do we get people more access to democracy and have those voices heard. And for me, it's not, even though I serve as a Democratic Speaker of the House, the idea of ballot access and folks exercising the franchise is a fundamental part of democracy. And so when it comes to ranked choice voting, I believe that ranked choice voting is that next step in ensuring that every citizen has an exercise to elect the person of their choice, their preferred candidate to office. The reason ranked choice voting makes so much sense and made so much sense to me as compared to first across the post or winner take all. We're not even talking about that, but first across the post, is there have been so many instances in this country, and we've seen it in Colorado as well, where you have multiple candidates in a race and say 5, 6, 7, 8 candidates or more, and sometimes less. The person who gets elected may get elected, but oftentimes well less than 50% of the vote, 50% plus 1. And you can't well say that you have a mandate to govern effectively if 70% of everybody else didn't want you. And so the fundamental premise of ranked choice voting is that we ensure that a person who gets elected with 50% plus 1. So you can say that at least the majority, maybe not everybody, but a majority of people selected you and said, we agree with your platform and we want you to be the mayor, the governor, or whatever city council, or whatever you're running for. In this case, we want you to be the nominee of our party going into this next presidential election. From the Colorado perspective, we don't use it in presidential primaries yet, but starting in 2008, we allowed, and I was one of the co-sponsors of the bill in 2008, we allow what are called statutory cities, cities that don't have home rule, to use ranked choice voting. And most of those cities were in the mountains. There's 3 cities in the mountain. And I should say since then, several home rule cities who have their own charter have since adopted ranked choice voting. We haven't seen them use it in an election yet, but they've adopted it within the last two years or 3 years or so. So we should see them adopting it, using it in elections fairly soon. And I'm sure you heard from your county clerks that, because this is what county clerks do, love them to death, but they're generally are opposed. I'm sure my colleague from Utah will attest to that. Bill, he's not that type of county clerk, are generally opposed to anything that disrupts the status quo. I teach a public policy class, and one of the things I tell our students, I teach a class on forging state and regional compromise to master's level public policy students. And one of the things I say is that if you're going to compromise on something to develop new public policy, it has to improve upon the status quo. Ranked choice voting in presidential primaries is one of those things that improves upon the status quo for this reason. In 2020, Colorado, we had moved our presidential primary up so that we could have a say because we were at the back end. We were an August primary or something like that. And no one cared about what we thought because we were so late. Turns out, despite the fact that we moved our primary up, no one cared what we had to say in March because South Carolina happened. And we have vote by mail. In Colorado, we have universal vote by mail. So the ballots go out 30 days before, and it's become so popular that most of our ballots are turned back in well before election day because people really like their vote by mail. So as people are turning in their vote by mail, and that process is going on, Joe Biden wins South Carolina, everybody else drops out. So we had all these people who had voted, including me. I voted for Bloomberg. I'll say it now. I voted for Bloomberg because there were some other how we are as politicians. We make all these weird calculations about why we're going to do things, even if we don't necessarily think that person's the best person. We still may make a decision to be with that person. And voters do the same thing because they're trying to game out who would be the most electable person, who would be the person who makes the most sense, vote with your head, not with your heart. So we ended up with all these folks who cast all these ballots for Klobuchar, for Bloomberg, for Sanders, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter because by the time you got to us, everybody was gone.
Yeah. We're familiar with that in
Yeah.
Vermont.
It was March, we're March, the first week of March.
And so you know how those things work.
Yeah.
Ranked choice ranked choice voting in presidential primaries, for the most part, eliminates that issue because you have an opportunity to rank your votes, especially in a state like Vermont that has vote by mail and where this matters. You get a chance to rank your votes and so that you're not completely, I don't want to say useless, but that your vote wasn't wasted. And what we found in Colorado, that we almost had 20% of our votes wasted because people, the candidates they preferred, it dropped out the race by the time they had a chance to vote. And that seems utterly undemocratic to me, that you don't get to vote or have your vote counted for some particular reason. And ranked choice voting ensures that you still have the ability to vote for the person of your choosing. It may not be your first choice, but you still get a second choice or your third choice, depending. I'm not sure how the bill is actually crafted here. If you have how many choices you get, I know at their vote, we kind of go with, kind of limited to 5 votes, 5 choices, so it's manageable. But you still get to vote. And one of the beauties of ranked choice voting is that it also allows you to vote with your head and your heart. So you may be able to rank your heart person with your first choice and your head person with your second choice. And you get to feel like you did the right thing at the end of the day. Now, back to the more direct question about county clerks. When I was in the legislature, I ran many of the bills that became precursors to Colorado. And we could like to think of ourselves, Colorado, as the blue ribbon state on election and voting reform, because a lot of things that other people are doing, we did already.
There are 2 blue ribbons.
Vermont. Yes. I wanted to, because what do you be, the Green Mountain State? Or,
Yeah.
So the Green Mountain State and the Rocky Mountain State, the
Yes.
Centennial State. The states with mountains and skiing. I'm not saying Utah doesn't have skiing.
And cannabis.
Got a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And some of that.
We have cannabis? I did not even know that.
Yeah, we do.
In Colorado, I didn't even know we had cannabis. Gosh.
We'll walk you down to Capitol Cannabis later.
So I was involved in many of the early bills that led to that. Our first move away from precinct voting to vote centers. Our 2008 bill, which first allowed for statutory cities to have ranked choice voting. Our early versions of, our early attempts at motor voter, things like that. And so I've dealt a lot with county clerks on election issues. I love them to death. And I will never say anything bad about them because they have some of the hardest jobs in government. But their impetus is always to protect the status quo and find reasons not to do something new. And time again, we've found that even when they said they couldn't do something new, they could do something new. And they would do it very well and within timelines that it took to get it done. I know ranked choice voting seems very scary because what do you do? Machines and things like that. But many of the vendors, and I think you heard from my colleague Deb Otis probably earlier in the week, and she's more expert at this than I am, especially on the math and all those things. But one of the things that I found, and you'll be better at election administration than I am, but one of the things I found is that many of the newer machines from companies like Dominion and et cetera are already prepared to handle ranked choice ballots. So it's not something that you're going to have to go out and someone's going to have to create brand new systems and machines and algorithms and mathematical formulas to do audits. The work has been done. It's almost plug and play at this point.
Never heard of it.
You haven't?
Never heard that. Oh, really?
Wow.
Sounds so.
My generation invented it. Gen X, we invented plug and play.
That's right.
Yes, people, we're forgotten generation. People forgot about all the cool stuff we've done as Gen Xers.
It's true. It's true. These millennials, they're
So hard.
They forgot about
I'm a
it.
baby boomer, so plug and play is like not what we.
We invented, we had Atari before there was Xbox.
It's true.
So there would be no Xbox without Atari.
It's true.
And so, yes, I take seriously the concerns of the clerks, but I also understand from my experience working with clerks in Colorado and other states where I've worked that this is not undoable. And that it's something that can be done, in a time frame to be prepared for if you want to do this in 2024. I mean, it can be done. The key piece here that makes it workable is how much voter education that you do and preparing voters for this. And a good example of how voter education works very well, one, it worked well in Alaska and people did it well in Alaska, but probably the biggest case study for this, the New York the New York municipal elections, and New York's bigger than Alaska by far, from 2-3 years ago now. I just had a birthday a few weeks ago, so I've lost track of time now. I'm now 54, so time is all relative to me. And when it was it 2 or 3 years ago? I feel like my mother now. I'm like, Mom, it was 10 years ago, not 2 years ago.
Especially with the pandemic. It's
Especially
totally
the
messed
pandemic.
all of us
This is
up.
where Google is very helpful.
This is
We
where
could just
Google's
Google it and find out.
This is where Google is very helpful. So New York City, which is, the biggest example, biggest city in America, one of the most diverse cities in America. United America and several other groups actually did polling afterwards because some of the complaints that were made about ranked choice voting, which you may have heard, it's confusing. People won't understand it. It's especially confusing for older voters and voters of color. What we found was that was all wrong. Because there was substantial voter education included. That's the best practice, is to make sure that in the legislation, the enabling legislation, that you ensure that there's education component in there, that you mandate that people get educated on this. So what we found in the polling, the exit polling, was that people understood how to use it. They want to use it again, especially older people and people of color. They use all their choices for the most part, because people said, well, they're just going to pick one. I think well north of 85% used all their choices
Right.
at one point. They found it easy to use. They found it understandable, because one of the complaints is ballot styles and how are people going to figure out the ballots. they figured it out.
Yeah.
Because there was education with this. And the byproduct was that you also ended up with the most diverse city council in the history of the city of New York. And you ended up with a city council with a majority of women elected in the city of New York for the first time. And communities that were very diverse and normally felt marginalized. And this doesn't have to be, you know, a color thing, but in New York, it's a color thing. Because I come from a state where this, they had an African American Speaker of the House, but 2% of the state, 3% of the state is African American. So we sometimes look at marginalization a little different. So you have rural parts of the state that sometimes feel like they're not heard, the mountain communities. And so the same thing can happen here in terms of places of the parts of the state that sometimes feel like they're not heard. Ranked choice voting gives them the opportunity to elect a candidate with their preference at the end of the day. And so
That's a great point about the rural parts of the state feeling like they're being heard. So thank you for mentioning
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
That's terrific. That's a great addition to the quiver.
yeah. Senator Bielanski, did you want to ask a question?
He did, and it sort of plays into what you just said in terms of voter education. I think in some ways, Alaska probably has more similarity to Vermont than New York City does, just in terms of rural, like the rural nature of the state. And so one of the things in terms of voter education is what if any impact you have seen or anticipate due to technological access. You know, we have whole swaths of the state that don't have broadband, that don't have cell phone service. And so how does that impact the voter education?
the beauty of voter education isn't necessarily require that people have to go online. You can adapt how you do education and based on the part of the state that you're in. I mean, so you could theoretically do a roadshow and do PowerPoint right in front of people as opposed to mandating that it's something that was done online, because we have the same issue in Colorado is that, you know, some of our most rural parts of the state have very poor broadband, if any broadband in the state. So we face the same issue in parts of our state. And Vermont's like Alaska or even Utah, this has a lot of rural parts of the state in Colorado. There are other things where the state has done education programs where broadband access has not stopped the state from doing public education. For instance, around COVID, everybody figured out how to do some type of education around COVID in some type of way. It doesn't have to be an online type of thing. So it's something that's not a deal breaker at all. It's just have to, I just have to say, I hate to say, you just have to figure it out. But as my family sit down south says, sometimes you got to get her done. And there's always ways to figure out how to get her done.
Yeah. Did you in Colorado or in other places, you know, working with partners that beyond the government doing the voter education?
It takes more than the government.
Yeah,
I mean, it really, and most parties, I mean, party politics, especially in presidential primaries, they will figure out a way.
True, it's true.
To educate their voters on how to get this done. Most good government groups, you'll see a lot of groups that represent traditionally marginalized people get involved in voter education. In Alaska, there was a coalition of indigenous communities that came together to do voter education around how ranked choice voting would work for them and how it would impact their community in particular.
It's interesting. Senator Clarkson.
February 2021. New York.
Right, that's when it was. Thank you.
Okay, I remember because our son voted and found it so simple. My question is, you know, we've discussed this a little bit, is how was the political play in Colorado? Was it a divisive issue between the Republicans and the Democrats? Was it a bipartisan vote? And what would you recommend to us to try and make it a non-political decision for us as we move forward?
In 2008, when we did this, as I remember, because no one knew what the heck it was, it just kind of went. I mean, it wasn't.
So it was a non-political issue.
It was a non-political issue. And in most places, ranked choice voting is non-political, non-partisan. We'll hear from Utah, which is considerably redder than Colorado. Considerably. Considerably. You know, I mean, we're kind of bluish, you know, and they're like not even reddish. They're not even George Santos. They're just like full on red. There's no ish with it. They're just full on red. And they've used ranked choice voting successfully. The Virginia Republican Party has used ranked choice voting in their latest primaries. It's only become one of these things recently because there's some people in leadership in the Republican Party that have decided that most of the electoral system is broken.
Oh, well, there's that, but I mean, that's.
But I think what you'll hear from him is that there's circumstances where it benefits Republicans, and especially in close seats. And circumstances where it benefits Democrats, especially in close seats. And when you have 3 people running in a two-party, well, two of the regular parties and a spoiler person running, both parties have an interest in it not being a spoiler that takes away votes in super close seats. And ranked choice voting eliminates the spoiler. And both parties have interest in eliminating spoilers at the end of the day.
Another good point.
Senator White?
Thank you, Chair Hardy. So one of the questions I've been asking most of our witnesses is, as you think about the primary system, have you discovered any calculation changes by people running for office when there's a ranked choice voting system? Are people choosing to go as an independent rather than being in a ranked choice system, or are folks running as independents post-primary more often because maybe they've seen where they've broken out on the ranked choice? If they find out that they're, oh gosh, I have to be everybody's second choice, are they more likely to run as an independent? Like, has it changed the political calculus for candidates?
Not in that manner. I don't think there's any data points to show that. I think what has changed in political calculation, and where we've seen it in the United States, and also when you look outside the United States and you do some comparative politics, is the nature in which people campaign changes.
Yeah.
Because if you know that you need support from other folks, that you want people to make you their second and third choice, you're less inclined to say Joe Blow is a QAnon puppet. You're less inclined to say that.
Yeah.
Because you would hope that because you and Joe Blow are somewhat similar, that you leave room open for Joe Blow's people to support you. So it's important in politics, in my belief, that you do make clear distinctions between. I think robust campaigning is important because people should have the ability to make clear choices and have clear choices presented to them. Negative campaigning is a different beast in and of itself. And that's what we hope to eliminate. And there's some evidence that it does, because you have to speak to a broader audience. And it's almost like what you see when you go right now in a similar system where we go from primaries to generals, the way things work, how people really appeal to a very narrow audience in a primary because their bases are very narrow, and then they pivot to try to get a broader context. What you see in ranked choice voting is that pivot happens almost immediately.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you. Are there other questions at the moment? And do you have anything else you would like us to know at the moment, or?
This is my first time to Vermont.
Oh, great! Thank you for coming.
I'm liking it in Vermont. I wasn't
You've
sure.
been here, what, a day?
Yeah, but it's quaint.
It is quaint.
It's like this little bridge that came under to get over here, like an old railroad trestle. I
Yeah.
was like, this is super cool. I mean, you just don't see this.
You don't have railroad trestles in Colorado.
Well, I live in the city. And then, I used to own a ranch because I'm actually, I raised horses and cattle for a little bit before I had to come back into town to do some different things. And it was like, we don't have that. I mean, it's just not, it felt very New England postcard, which is,
Totally.
which is what I
Go to Woodstock and you'll see a covered bridge right in the center of town.
brothers don't do Woodstock.
Why not?
Just kidding.
I was gonna say brothers.
They were the first one.
They've done Woodstock before us.
It's a different Woodstock.
I mean,
It's
yeah, we're gonna
Woodstock,
do.
Vermont, not Woodstock, New York.
Oh,
But
Yeah.
brothers did Woodstock, New York too, once in a while.
I know, I just like,
Yeah, just yank it.
You made her stop and think, that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely should see a covered bridge and,
Yeah.
and some of our horses and cows, and Ben and Jerry's and all the, Maple
oh, Ben
syrup,
and Jerry's. I'm
all the things.
gonna have to come back for a longer trip, because I have to go back to Boston after this. My godson is a second-year law student at Harvard.
Oh,
And
How's he enjoying it?
he's enjoying it. I mean, I don't know why he became a lawyer. You've seen me
He
and,
isn't there yet. He hasn't become
Minister
one yet.
next.
no, he won't do that. I know him well enough. He went to the same undergraduate institution that I went to, so he's kind of like following me around.
nice. He respects you.
Does he live in Colorado?
Yeah, because he lives in Colorado. I mean, his mother was my classmate in college, and she's from Colorado, and so it was kind of. She went to our sister school. I was an all-male HBC. I went to Morehouse.
Hey,
And she went to Spelman. Thank you.
Morehouse.
Yeah.
And so
Great debate team.
I was captain of the debate team when I was at Morehouse.
You're looking at. you two
But I'm much
sharing
older than
this.
you, class of
Yeah.
'92.
Well, you
so-
guys, you kicked our butts. So,
You are a baby.
Well,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for joining us. And
Thank you for having me.
please
Great to
stick
have you.
around. We would love to do a little photo op after we hear from our next
Oh,
speaker.
absolutely.
Yeah, and.
And come back.
Yeah, come back.
I'll have to come back. And your
Take you
next
around.
speaker's a rock star.
Excellent.
Well,
Well,
you're a rock star too. It's good. It's
Yeah.
the rock team.
person before the.
Mr. Daniels.
So I want you to know what a rock star you were while you were testifying. My son, who's the state's attorney in Windsor County, came in, sat down. I didn't even acknowledge him. You were so compelling.
Oh, thank you.
Next, we have Josh Daniels, who is a former clerk of Utah County in Utah. Okay, got that.
That's down, that's the city.
And I'll let you tell the story. You've heard us introduce ourselves. So why don't you tell us about your experiences with RCV and what we should know?
Awesome. Thank you, Madam Chair, Senator. It's great to be with you here in Vermont. I likewise have not been here very often, but the last time I was here was about 20 years ago this month. I lived in Gardner, Massachusetts, and I visited Brattleboro once. So
Oh.
I'm glad to be back here 20 years later. So I came into office in 2019 as actually what happened was a good friend of mine became the first female elected to be a county clerk auditor in Utah County, Utah. And she twisted my arm and made me come to be her chief deputy. My background by training is also as an attorney, and I've largely worked in public policy and government relation type roles, done compliance work and nonprofit work and those kinds of things. And so I'd never before administered an election before 2019. And so I came into this office and I later served as the clerk auditor. Utah County is the second largest county in the state of Utah. We have about 700,000 people. So it's about like Vermont, but crunched into just one county in terms of population. Unfortunately, in that population, we only have one ice hockey rink with 2 sheets of ice, which is a huge disappointment to my sons who play hockey on account of our next door neighbors who are from Canada, who are the best friends, and they got my boys into hockey. So now we're a hockey family, but we've only got 2 sheets of ice for 700,000 people.
Wow.
The horror, could you imagine how difficult life would be?
You should move here. We got a lot of hockey.
I know,
rinks.
I know, exactly. But from one ski town to another, it's good to be here. Also, Utah owes its founding to a Vermonter, Brigham Young from Vermont, founded Utah. So some of that Vermont pioneering spirit that led people to go live in the middle of the desert. And it's pretty dry there. But so in 2019, we came into office to oversee elections. Had never before been involved in overseeing elections. Our staff turned over by more than 50%. And our legislature had given cities the opportunity to opt into doing ranked choice voting. And many of the clerks around the state didn't want to do it because they were very nervous about it. It seemed complex and risky. And so us being novices and naive, perhaps, we said, sure, we'll do it. And in that same year, in 2019, we turned over 50% of our staff. We adopted a completely new and different election system. We changed all of our election processes, and we did ranked choice voting, all as novices in the election space, and we did not have any problems. It was actually not that challenging. Similar to Vermont, you use, as I understand, Dominion, which is one of the leading election vendors in the country. In Utah, we use ES&S, which is one of their biggest competitors, also a leading vendor. Both of those major systems can facilitate ranked choice voting without any problem. Utah County specifically had used Dominion previously, but we were switching because of some state contracting arrangements that made it advantageous. So, we heard all of these concerns about ranked choice voting, and so we did some research. We wanted to make sure that voters would be able to understand it. So one of the things we did was we tested this theory that perhaps older voters had problems with the ballot. We took ranked choice designed ballots to some assisted living centers in our community. And we told the residents that we were just kind of doing some training and some testing on elections generally. We gave zero instructions about ranked choice voting. We didn't have any instructions with the ballot. We simply gave them ranked choice designed ballots that have the terminology, please rank your favorite from first to last or what have you. And we used a sample election. In this case, it was what's your favorite national park, because we have 5 to choose from in our state. And so it worked out perfect. And then as we handed the ballots out, we meandered the audience to just listen to what was being said and to see if there was confusion. And we talked to some of the residents and, kind of confirmed, oh, do you vote? Oh, I vote every year. And we actually later looked up some of those voters, and they hadn't voted in about 10 years. But I think in their perspective, they saw themselves as very active voters previously. And, that last 10 years maybe had gone by a little quicker, and they hadn't really thought about the fact that they hadn't voted in quite some time. But they seemed to be very familiar with the idea of voting. And we detected zero confusion from the ballot. I mean, there was a few conversations. Well, which one are you going to vote for? Well, I can vote for all 5, but which one's your favorite? And, so what we learned was that the ballot itself is intuitive. Humans understand this idea of good, better, best, favorite, least favorite. You go to the grocery store. Do I want chocolate, vanilla, strawberry? This concept of rank ordering your preferences, we do this all the time in our life. You do this around the dinner table. You do this in conversations with friends. And you particularly do this in politics. Most average people that aren't particularly political, which is most people, they think about politics and policy as a world of options where there are trade-offs. There's good, better, best. There's what I prefer. There's what I don't prefer. And this is super common, I think, in the presidential primary, where if you're in one particular party and you're trying to decide which of the 7 flavors of your political party you like, you're starting to compare them and think, well, I like this candidate better than this other candidate, which is better than this other candidate. It makes perfect sense to look at the presidential primary in a ranked preference way, which is why I think this bill is a particularly strong concept that can certainly help parties to better coalesce against a candidate that they can all agree on. So in Utah, we did this ballot testing, and we were very surprised that we didn't detect this confusion element that is reported. That's not to say that there aren't voters that might be confused. I'm sure there are. But our experience was that initially we didn't have concerns. So we were the first county in Utah to implement this pilot to do ranked choice voting, largely because we were new as a county clerk administration and didn't see any problem with trying something new. And so we did this for 2 different years, 2019 and 2021. We started with a couple of cities in our county, which were the only cities in the state that did it at that time. And then in 2021, 23 cities across the state of Utah opted to use ranked choice voting, including some in other counties. And so those county clerks administered ranked choice voting similar to the way we did, didn't have significant problems. One particular county, speaking of Terrence's discussion of how red Utah is. Utah County is the most Republican county in Utah, but one of the, if not the most Democrat county in Utah is Grand County, which actually is named after an African-American settler in one of the early Utah ranchers, actually, William Grandview. And so the city of Moab, which is a big outdoor place, right? That city did ranked choice voting, but their county clerk was new and unfamiliar, didn't have certain kinds of equipment. So what we did as a county is we actually administered their election for them on a contract basis. And that worked out pretty well. And our staff got to go see some arches as they went and picked up ballots. So it was really good. So we administered ranked choice voting for 9 different cities in 2021. So I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of implementing ranked choice voting and some of the considerations that you want to think about. Ballot design. So the biggest difference in ranked choice voting is the way a voter votes. They're voting by ranking their preferences, which necessitates a slightly different design to the ballot. You have a list of names, but instead of one bubble per name, you have kind of a grid format where you bubble based on, you know, which is your first, second, third, and so on. That ballot design is compatible with the major election vendors, particularly the ones that you use. And in our case, we were able to design that ballot just the same way we designed any of the other ballots. We used all the same software that our vendor provides to design those ballots, and we use the same printer to print those ballots. We use the same scanners or optical scanners to tabulate those ballots. We could even have mixed races on the same ballot. You could have a ranked choice voting race for, let's say, city council, and a not ranked choice voting race for mayor on the same ballot. And we didn't have any problems with that. That was fairly seamless for us. The other consideration is tabulation. In the election space, when you use the word tabulation, it usually means counting the ballots. And we count the ballots with optical scanners, which I believe is how you do it as well. Voters vote on a paper ballot. Those paper ballots are then scanned by optical scanners. Our optical scanners, similar to the ones that you have, you can scan, you know, mixed ballots, whether it's from city A or city B. So in our case, the tabulation process was no different. There were no hurdles there.
Do you have any hand count areas or towns?
No, so we optically scan all of our ballots.
Okay, because that is a concern here. We have 100, so
I've
we
heard
don't have
yes.
counties.
There's city
we have
clerks, right?
Municipal clerks.
Yeah,
And some of them are very tiny.
right.
And they do hand counting.
Right.
So that is the sort of how, did you have any protocols for moving ballots from one place to another and just security or timing of that?
Yeah, so in the case of the city that we did, which was hundreds of miles away from our county,
Yeah.
what we arranged was when the ballots, by the way, we're a universal vote by mail state, similar to Vermont. And we've been doing that for almost 10 years in Utah. We followed the example of Colorado and adopted that quite some time ago. But in the case of Moab, which was a neighboring city, like 300 miles away neighboring, we sent the ballots to those voters with the return address being our election headquarters in Utah County.
Mhm.
So I could see a model where in Vermont, municipal clerks maybe team up. Maybe there's regional places, maybe you work together in kind of a co-op fashion where some of these hand count jurisdictions could team up with neighboring jurisdictions. And, you know, at least for the presidential primary, because often that's at a unique time. And so, you know, maybe there could be some teaming up there so that they could go ahead and use their optical scanners rather than hand count.
Mhm.
I think there's a variety of options you could look at for how you can handle hand count. Because it sounds to me like right now, if you're hand counting ballots, you're probably keeping somewhat of a paper pencil tally sheet. And at some point, that data has to be input to something digital to report that more broadly. You could do something very similar with ranked choice voting. You could do a type of tally, because if you think about it, every ranked choice ballot, there are a finite number of combinations of how a voter could cast their ballot. If you have 5 candidates, then you have the permutations of, well, a voter could rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, you know. So there's a set number of possibilities, and you could tally those ballots by saying, hey, these 3 ballots have the same preference pattern. These 20 ballots have this other preference pattern. And you could you could sort of report the results that way and then give those results to a more central place like the state to go statewide. Because those results have to be reported up to the state anyway, right? So this is a good question about reporting. In our case, and the way ranked choice voting works in most jurisdictions, is after you scan or count each of these paper ballots, whether they be by mail or cast in person in a polling location, there is essentially a digital file that is the results of those ballots. And it's that digital file that you put into the utility that can help automate that IRV, instant runoff voting process. And we use that utility. You asked Terrence earlier about resources from other groups to help with implementation or education. There's a national group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. They're a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that exists to help clerks with implementation of ranked choice voting. One of the projects that they've done is they've created an open source free software utility that helps to automate that IRV process, the instant runoff process. And so we were able to use that as an add-on to our system. That add-on has been tested in a voting system test laboratory, which is a fancy word that basically indicates that it's federally certified and can be certified by states for use in the election system. So using that utility, you can automate the process of the IRV. All you need to do is then input these digital results files that already come out of the existing systems that most jurisdictions use. So that's covering, ballot design, tabulation, data reporting, and then I think education and training is important. You had asked about that. One of the things that we did some billboards, we did some online ads, we created a video that helped, voters to visualize how ranked choice voting works. And here's the beauty of vote by mail. Every voter, most voters anyway, 97% in our jurisdiction vote by mail. They're getting the ballot in the mail. You can put an insert with that ballot package that includes information and training. I'm sure your clerks do this now. But that's a great, easy opportunity to give information to the voter about how ranked choice voting works. Another thing I think you should consider is doing some kind of perhaps non-binding public opinion poll. You could do it online to make it free and easy to distribute, but using a ranked choice ballot in advance of your presidential primary. So as part of your voter outreach and education effort, you could give voters an actual experience using a ranked choice ballot through some kind of an opinion poll. I think that would be useful. Maybe there's some topics of interest that are either fun or attractive in some way that might get more voter participation. But you get people in the community talking about and using and interacting with the ranked choice ballot. That could be a great way to help with voter education and outreach. Let me touch on one last thing that I think is particularly important when it comes to presidential primaries, and that has to do with overseas voters. Under federal law, the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, there's a section of that law, UOCAVA, which deals with uniformed and overseas voters and their right to be able to vote. So let me tell you a personal story about myself. Among the other things I do, I joined the Marines, and I'm a combat veteran. And in 2007, I was part of the surge, and I was deployed to Fallujah, Iraq. And being a political nerd, here I am in the fall of 2007, in the spring of 2008, in the Chow Hall between combat missions, watching on the television as both the Republican and Democrat candidates duke it out in the debates, because it was an open election. You had, Obama, Clinton, and Edwards, and on the Republican side, you had McCain and Romney and Giuliani and the others. And so that was, fascinating as a political science nerd. But I didn't participate in that election because at the time, the UOCAVA process just wasn't very slick, and I didn't end up being able to participate in that presidential primary. And one of the ironies was that at the Chow Hall, there were a team of other people, lots of different units, but one of the units was a Navy SEAL unit. And being a future lawyer myself, I met this guy who was a lawyer but worked with the Navy SEALs. He advised the Navy SEALs, but he was an attorney. And I didn't know at the time he was a political nerd, but his name was Ron DeSantis. So I didn't get to know him well, but I did meet him. And, it's been fun to go back and be like, wait, Ron DeSantis was in Fallujah at the same time I was. I remember meeting this lawyer. And anyway, so I don't know if he got to vote in that presidential primary.
Oh, wow.
Maybe not. right?
Small world.
Very small world, yeah. But something that I think is important is that, these overseas voters, they have preferences about these presidential primaries, but it takes weeks for that ballot to get back to Vermont and get counted. And oftentimes, by the time that happens, some of those candidates have maybe dropped out of the race. And so one of the innovations around the country that a lot of southern states that have a lot of military personnel are doing is they're using ranked choice voting for presidential primaries with a focus on these overseas citizens and members of the military. Because if they can submit a ranked choice ballot, then if some of those candidates have already been eliminated from the running prior to counting that vote, then they can still be able to cast a vote for their preferred candidate by using the ranked choice ballot. And so I think that's a really strong use case, one that resonates deeply with me because I wish I'd been able to participate in that primary. So that's a little bit about our experience in Utah. One thing we did was after we ran the ranked choice voting election, we did a survey to those voters who had participated in the election. And we had two different cities, one that was a very new city with a young population and a very old city that, one of the first cities of our county with a much older population. And in both cases, voters reported that they liked using ranked choice voting and either favored it for future elections or even more in different types of elections. And that was over 80% that responded that way. And similarly, over 80% of our voters expressed that they found the ballot easy to use. And both of those were surprising to us because we had heard criticism, we'd heard concern about implementation, we heard concern about ballot confusion, and we didn't experience that. Now, I will say, clerks are a risk-averse bunch for good reason. The last thing you want to do is undermine one of the most fundamental parts of our democracy, and that's voting. And one of the things I want to do is tip my hat to the clerks and the election staff in Vermont, like any state, having been in the election in 2020. No clerk in America thought that they were going to have to run a primary election in the year 2020 in the way that they did. In our county, we had for the first time ever a drive-through election, and the logistics and the planning and the complexity that went into running an election in the middle of a pandemic was staggering, but our staff rose to the occasion, as did election administrators all over the country. And so I have a lot of faith and confidence in election administrators. They are by their nature flexible. You have to be. Things happen on election day. You have to be able to pivot. They are master coordinators of logistics. They are masters at checklists. And I think that they are, as a class, up to the task of doing something new like ranked choice voting. And so I'm excited for your opportunity to do that in Vermont if it comes to it, and any questions I can answer.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Senator Watson.
Thank you. So I have a philosophical question that through our conversations about ranked choice voting, it's been kind of bubbling up for me, and I'm not sure who's the right person to ask this question. So I'm just gonna put it out there. It comes up relatively frequently that there's a limit to like having the first 5 choices, right? You're not going to go extend out to like the 10th choice or the 20th choice, should there be that many candidates. Why 5? Is it a physical limitation of the ballot? Is it that people just probably don't, keep track of things more than beyond like their top 5 choices? The thing that I just get, like from a philosophical perspective, like one possibility that I could see is like, let's say you had like 20 candidates, you wanted to rank all 20 of them. That just like, how do you fit? Can you fit that on the ballot?
Right.
Anyway.
Great questions.
Yes, thanks.
So I would say, Senator, all of the above. Is it true that voters can't keep track of more than 5 candidates? Well, maybe in some cases, that's a lot to kind of think about. 5, maybe that is a limit. Not for everybody, but for some people, perhaps it is. So maybe that's one reason states might limit rankings to 5. Another might be some systems have just been designed with 5 as the maximum limit, right? And that's fine. I think that's better than just 1, right? But and then to your point about, well, how many can you fit on a ballot? In our case, if I can borrow your Senator, your agenda, we designed our ballot instead of like this, we designed it like that. because we had a city council race with 8 to 10 candidates. And so when you go to a different sort of landscape format, you can fit more names on the page. And those can scan the same way as anything else. It doesn't really matter what the orientation is. And with ballots, this is common because you never know in an election how many races you're going to have. And it's common that one year you might have an 8.5 by 11 ballot, and the next one you might have a 20-inch long ballot. And so, depending on the race and what you're putting on the ballot, you have a lot of flexibility in how you design the paper. So, but yes, you're probably right that if you go simply portrait style, maybe 5 is kind of a physical limitation there. So that's something that some states have looked at, is limiting the rankings, or you might look to your system. I believe that the Dominion system natively limits it to 5 rankings. And so to your point, is it a philosophical question, is 5 sufficient? I think 5 probably is sufficient in most cases, because at the end of the day, typically what happens, let's say you have a large field of candidates, 8 or something like that. One of the winners is going to be one of the top. There's going to be 3 that kind of cluster at the top, and then everyone else is going to trail off. And so as a voter, you probably have a strong preference about at least 2 of those top 3. And that really helps to create the outcome you want, which is that your vote is not wasted when one candidate doesn't really meet the cut of that first tranche that maybe the top 3, so to speak. So I think 5 rankings is a good number to give most, if not all, voters the ability to cast a preference for one of the candidates that's likely to be the finalist, which is where we can kind of reveal how everybody's preferences mesh together to create consensus around a majority, rather than this plurality system where we've got all these candidates and the winner or the top 2 end up with 10 or 15% of the vote, which isn't very dispositive of what voter opinion really is about those candidates. So
just as a follow-up, so Dominion, you said natively has a limit of 5, but it sounds like you could program it to do, or put in a format basically that was more than 5 if you want.
Yeah, and I can't speak specifically to Dominion. So what I know is that their native system that will conduct the IRV process is a limit of 5 rankings.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't know is, could you facilitate more rankings, still generate the same type of data, and then use that data with this utility I described to then do the IRV process. But within the Dominion system right now, it can automate the IRV process natively with 5 rankings.
So if we went with 5 rankings as an initial, limit, I wonder if that would require less training for clerks on the front end.
I don't know that it's very different how many rankings you do, because the number of rankings, I think, really impacts what you zeroed in on is voter preference, voter opinion. And the other piece of that might have complexity, the instant runoff voting process, that it doesn't matter how many rankings you have, because that process is automated through this utility.
Okay.
So it takes the complexity out of it. You don't have to hand count the ballots.
Sure.
and kind of swap and move, and you don't have to do it that way, which I've done a lot of that. In our Republican Party in Utah, we've been using ranked choice voting for our party elections in conventions. And I've been part of counting ranked choice ballots for years and years. So it's kind of ironic to then be a county clerk and to do ranked choice voting in a real election. So, but it's so much easier with this utility.
The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, did they provide any technical assistance to
Yes.
you to what kind of technical assistance did they provide?
Great question, Senator. So aside from providing what's the most important service is that free utility, they are there to help you through the process, answer questions of a technical nature. They can help review the data and identify if there's any problem or reason for concern. As somebody that, if you're a clerk and you're new to ranked choice voting, you've got questions. They've got experts that are familiar with the science and some of the details of implementation. And they work hand in hand with other groups that support ranked choice voting. Terrence talked about Fair Vote, which is one of the leading advocacy groups for ranked choice voting. But the Resource Center is really positioned to help clerks to implement.
Mm-hmm.
And the resources are very helpful. I was actually on the phone with them a number of times with some technical questions and things like that.
Awesome, thank you. And then my other question, I don't know the ins and outs of Utah voting law, but do you, with universal mail-in ballots, do you also allow ballot curing for technical errors?
We do, yes.
How does ranked choice interplay with ballot curing?
So for us, ballot curing is typically focused on a signature that doesn't match or a signature that's missing. Maybe some other technical defects that have more to do with the submission and reception of the ballot, because we don't even open the envelope until we've confirmed that we're going to count that ballot. So if we open the envelope and all of a sudden there's an error or something, or it's blank, like that can't be cured, because we're not going to go, we don't pair up who submitted which ballot. So there's that anonymity piece of it. So yeah, we allow ballot curing, but it's more for those technical issues. And we do 100% signature matching in our jurisdiction. Some of that's automated with an image thing, and then some of that is actually human review. And so we, before accepting and opening the ballot, we've reviewed the signature. And I mean, that has a lot to do with the strength and the data capabilities of your voter registration system, and whether you have signatures on file and things like that. But yeah, good question.
Senator Clarkson, and then
I'm just curious, did you burn out? What, you're no longer clerk,
Yeah.
you're a former clerk, what happened?
Well, as I mentioned earlier before the meeting, I was the clerk and auditor. So I oversaw the budget, the finances, as well as, elections and some other services. And I liked both, and the county decided to split. In fact, the previous clerk, my friend who was the first female clerk, she went on to become the first female commissioner, which is how I landed as the clerk and auditor. So I'd never sought the office. I'd never thought to run for election. I kind of got pulled into it. And then when they split the two offices, there was some political dynamics about elections and just, I will say, certainly in this country, when it comes to election administration, things change after the 2020 election. There's a lot more angst over elections. And I felt like, giving somebody else a shot might help to heal some of those political wounds. So I didn't feel the need to continue and run for re-election.
So you're now the auditor?
No,
No,
I'm
so you're
out.
not neither.
Yep. I'm going to go help election reform all around the country and working on some other projects, tech startups and things like that. So I'm no longer in elective office.
Well, thank you for your work on this.
yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. And hopefully people will watch your testimony when they have questions about whether we can do it in such a fast timeline. So
And they're always free to call anything you need. There's a lot of clerks and election administrators around the country that have had experience, and they love to lend a hand and help you all be successful.
Yeah, and we have a modest example of a quick turnaround in Burlington, who had to do a special election in under fairly short order and did ranked choice voting with some degree of success.
I think they worked with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center as well. When I was talking to the city clerk, I think that they actually came to Burlington and helped provide on the ground support.
Well, we have a next witness already. She's not here yet? Oh, okay. All right then.
Are we running ahead of schedule?
No, we're
Yeah.
not. She's not here. Kate Salas.
We don't
Is-
have
What happened to the mayor?
Jake, we asked if we could reschedule because we had out of town guests, so he's not coming today.
I just let her know we're running a little late, and so.
Okay, all right, well, maybe we should take a picture